So my wife, Cindy, who is not up here, thankfully, to hear this, was born a year and a half before I was. And so seeking her wisdom based on her, increased life experience, I asked her one day, I said, honey, since you were born back in the 60s, can you fill me in a little bit on what the whole peace movement was about? I was born in the 70s and I missed that entire decade. Can you fill me in a little? And her response demonstrated, I think, the opposite of the peace movement, which as it turns out, may have been my fault. I guess maybe the way I worded the question could use a little work. I need to look at that a little bit. But I have actually always been interested in the 60s peace movement. I have. I always, maybe it's because we live in a world that seems so far removed from that era. Maybe I just never had a chance to experience it, but it's always seemed so attractive to me to live in a time when people are talking about peace, instead of just staking their claim that people are trying to achieve harmony among others. Doesn't that sound attractive? I think it does, maybe not the clothes or the hairstyles, but the rest of it, I don't know, it just seems so groovy, man, doesn't it? Peace is one of those important qualities mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned over 350 times in the Bible. Peace is mentioned over 350 times. Isn't that crazy? It's also one of those qualities that we seem to have a really stinking hard time with. From way back at the beginning of the Bible when Cain killed Abel, to the wars that happened throughout the Old Testament, to Jesus being nailed to a cross at the end of the Bible. Peace is this quality that humans have never been able to master. Right? We sing songs. We sing songs like, "Let there be peace on earth," and "I've got peace like a river." And I think we all would say that peace would be an ideal. Right? We love the idea of peace. But as soon as someone bumps into us, or someone says something negative about us on social media, our quest for peace goes right out the window. Now we can excuse it. We can excuse it for sure, right? They started it. I'm just finishing it. Right? Something like that. I understand. I'm not sure that my excuses hold a lot of water in God's mind. I noticed something, that when I had kids, my desire for my kids became this desire to have them not only get along, but to genuinely love each other. I don't just want them to get along. I want them to love each other. And isn't that what peace is? Peace is our love expressed in the way that we treat each other. Isn't that what it is? And don't you think that's what God wants for us, for all of his children? You're his child, and you're his child, and you're his child, you're his child. Don't you think that's what he wants for his children? Is to not only get along, but to genuinely love each other? Isn't that what God wants? He wants peace for his people. He wants peace. So here's a question for you. What do we do when we feel like peace isn't an option for us? Do you think, are there circumstances, situations when peace is not a real possibility? Do you think so? I think probably from an ideal perspective, we'd want to say, well, no. We can always work towards peace. But I think from a practical, day-to-day reality kind of perspective, I think we would probably say that there are times when peace is not in my hands. It is not within my control. But do you know what God says to that? He says, you're absolutely right. He says, you're right. I want to take a look at a passage from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. If you have a Bible, turn to Ecclesiastes, or a phone or tablet or whatever. If you want to use these blue ones that are in front of you, it's on page 552 or 1028 in the large print, the maroon large print. But it's going to be just about halfway through your Bible. Again, 552 or 1028 in the maroon ones. Ecclesiastes was written by King Solomon. And King Solomon was the son of King David. Solomon was known as a very powerful king, a very wealthy king, but more than anything else, he was known as to be wise. Solomon was known to be wise. And this book here, this Ecclesiastes, it's not a long book. This is Solomon's battle with the meaning of life. You know, Solomon, he looked at the unfairness in the world, and he looked at the repetitive cycles, and he wondered, well, what is this all supposed to be about? You know, what's the point of all of this? And that's what Ecclesiastes is about. Chapter 3 is one of his aha moments, one of his light bulb moments. And so we're going to look at verses 1 through 8. And so it's a passage that maybe you have heard before. But this is what Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes 3. He says, "For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." And I look at that, I read this, and you know, one of the interesting things about this, I think, is the recognition that there is a time for war and for death and for hate and for crying in the course of a life, that these things are naturally a part of life, you know? And I think when Solomon is writing this, I don't think he's saying necessarily that this is God's intention. He's just saying that this is the way it is, right? There is a time to kill and a time to heal. There's a time to cry and a time to laugh. There is a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to love and a time to hate. You know, is it ever God's desire that we kill and hate and tear? Is it ever God's desire? I don't think so. But I think Ecclesiastes is just saying that this is just the way that it is. And this fits in with our experience, doesn't it? I mean, there are times when we come across people who are not open to love and to care and to concern, right? Don't we come across people that are like that seem to oppose those things, that are not open to this? And there's lots of reasons for it. There's lots of reasons. Sometimes people have had a really rough upbringing, right? Sometimes people have not been given a proper moral foundation. Sometimes there's a mental illness involved. So sometimes there's reasons why not everybody is open to the good qualities that are listed here. Have you ever heard before that pit bulls can make very, very excellent pets when they are raised in a loving environment? Now, I'm talking about the dogs, not the singer, you know? Maybe it's true of the singer too, but when raised in a loving environment, do you guys know who Pitbull is? The singer? Okay, I want to be sure my joke okay, never mind. But anyway, when you raise pit bulls in a loving environment, they can turn out to be loving. But when you raise them in an environment where they're trained to fight, they become very vicious, you know? And don't you think the same is true for us as humans? I mean, we were made to love and to laugh and to sing, but we also have the potential in us to hate and to tear and to war. You know, we have those potentials. And again, I don't think this is the way God intended it to be. It's just the way that it is. And so even though God's intention is for us to live in peace, sometimes that option just isn't in our hands. You know? Paul talks about this in his New Testament letter to the Romans. In chapter 12, listen to what he says in chapter 12. He says, "Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see that you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone." I mean, do you get the implication there? Do you get the implication? Do all that you can to live in peace. But that doesn't assure us that peace is going to happen, right? Doing all that you can does not guarantee that the other guy is going to do all that he can. right? And I think that's why Solomon says, there is a time for war. There is a time to tear down. And I think that's why Paul encourages us to do all that we can, but clearly he leaves the door open for those times when peace is not in our power. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. But there are circumstances when we aren't the ones who decide whether or not peace is a reality, right? Sometimes other people take that option away from us. If somebody intends to do me harm, that's their intention, is to do me harm. No matter how hard I work for peace, it may not be a possibility. But do you know what I think? What I think Jesus and what Paul would say would be the greater danger? You know what the greater danger is? When I stop being the one who works for peace. That's the greater danger. I can't control what other people do. I can't control whether or not they're working for peace. But don't I have absolute control over my own actions? Don't I? And I think what Jesus is saying here in this passage is, hey, you, child of God, part of your role is to work for peace, no matter what the people around you are doing. There is a time for war, and there is a time for hate, and there is a time to tear down. But as children of God, you guys, we are not the ones who choose those times. We choose peace. We choose love. We choose to build up. Now, again, other people may force the issue. And then we don't have the control over that. But whatever is in our control ought to result in peace. True? Do you guys agree? Now, I think we probably all know from our experience that this is not an easy path to choose. Choosing to be a peacemaker is not an easy path. And the one quality that is going to be tested in me, the one quality that I really need, is self-control. Self-control. If somebody is pushing my buttons, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, the question is, do I have enough control to push my emotions aside to the point where my faith can lead my response instead of anger? Do I have enough control to do that? Because you know what? Peace is threatened anytime our emotions dictate our response. Peace is threatened whenever our emotions fuel our response. And don't think for a second that the devil doesn't know that. Don't think for a second that he is not aware of that. So whenever you're driving along, and somebody cuts you off, or if you're talking to someone and they kind of roll their eyes at something you say, or if somebody ignores advice that you give them, even really good advice that you give them, or if someone else gets the job that you want, or someone breaks up with you, do you know what's going on? Peace is hanging in the balance at that moment. Your willingness and your ability to be a representative of God is on the line at that moment. And like we said, there are times when other people make the decision for you that peace cannot be an option. The greater danger is when we opt out of peace because it feels better to fuel our emotions. That's the danger. You got to watch out for those times. You've got to watch out for those times, because those are the opportunities that you have to show the difference that Jesus makes in your perspective. And you don't want to treat those opportunities too casually, because you don't know how many opportunities you get before people just stop seeing a difference in you. In the 1950s, Pete Seeger wrote a song, Turn, Turn, Turn. And it was covered by a whole bunch of folk bands at the time, and it was made really, really popular by the Byrds in the 1960s. In fact, we're going to sing it as our closing song. We're not going to sing the Byrds version of it. We're going to sing the original version. But that Pete Seeger wrote that as an appeal to peace. And it's really interesting when you sing the song, pay attention to the words. All the words come right out of Ecclesiastes 3. Every word from that song comes out of Ecclesiastes 3, except for the last line. The last line Pete Seeger wrote himself, and it's, "A time for peace, I swear it's not too late." That's the only line that he wrote for this song. A time for peace, I swear it's not too late. And I think what Pete Seeger is doing is echoing what Jesus is saying, and what Solomon is saying, and what Paul is saying. That there is a time for war, and there is a time for hate, and there is a time for all the bad stuff, the negative stuff. But you guys, there's a time for peace. And we can work towards it. We have the ability to work towards that time for peace. And so we may look around the world, and Lori was talking about the situation in Mexico. We see the chaos going on in the Middle East and in Africa and other war-torn parts of the world. And we say, well, what kind of impact can I make there? How can I impact them? Directly, you may not be able to. Indirectly, you have a ton of power at your fingertips. And I'm not just talking about prayer. I hope that you're praying anyways for those situations. What I'm talking about is working towards peace in your own sphere around you. You hear that song that we sang a little bit ago, right? Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with someone else. It's not what it is. Let it begin with me, right? Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. I may not be able to affect peace around the world, but can I work for it right here? What would happen, you guys? Listen, what would happen if in the course of a week, through my actions, my ability and my willingness to push aside my anger, my willingness to control my language, my willingness to de-escalate emotions, what if I'm able to impact 2 people this week? 2 people, and help them understand how peace can guide their actions and their decisions. And what if, let's take it a step further, what if over the course of the next month, those 2 people impact 3 or 4 other people? Can you see how this might go? Can you see how it might go? Is this a possibility? I may not be able to impact peace around the world. How long would it really take me to make my mark in Lima? Do you ever hear that? Do you ever hear the phrase, think globally, act locally? Have you ever heard that before? Think globally, act locally. That is never more true than when we are working towards peace. I may think that my actions and my inactions and my expressions of anger and frustration and selfishness, I may think that they're secluded, that it's just affecting me, it's not affecting anyone else. That is so not true. That is so not true. The way I live my life, it creates ripple effects that are absolutely felt by others, and eventually those ripples reach around the world. The same is true with your actions towards peace. So what I want you to do is focus on today. Just today. Today, let there be peace on earth. And let it begin with you. I'm going to invite you to pray with me this morning.